everybody. Welcome back to WTF is on my mind. Today, we're tackling one of the most important yet often misunderstood topics in our culture. Yes, consent. Joining me are two extraordinary women who are leading the charge to redefine how we think about and legislate consent. Joyce Short and Nina Lucas of the Consent Awareness Network, or CAN. Is it CAN or is it CAN?
Can. We like
CAN.
can.
I like CAN. Joyce Short is the founder and CEO of CAN, a fierce advocate for embedding a clear definition of consent into our laws to combat sexual assault, domestic violence, and sex trafficking. A survivor herself, Joyce has channeled her personal experiences into impactful change, penning the book, Your Consent, The Key to Conquering Sexual Assault, and delivering a TED Talk on the subject. Her work has been instrumental in legislative reform and raising public awareness around the true meaning of consent as freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement, or FGKIA. Joining Joyce is Nina Lucas, the Chief of Staff at CAN. Nina has been a driving force in the organization's outreach efforts, working closely with lawmakers and communities to advance CAN's mission of codifying consent in penal codes. Together, these two women are reshaping the conversation around consent, empowering survivors, and fighting for a more just and informed society. So it's an absolute honor to have them here today to share their insights and groundbreaking work. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us here.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Good to see you.
Is there anything that I didn't include that's very important about both of you or either of you?
No, but there is something, at least as far as I'm concerned, maybe Nina has another opinion. But as far as I'm concerned, the thing that was left out was in defining consent, it's not only freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement, it's also by a person with the capacity to reason.
Yes, good
So
point.
if you don't
Good
have the
point.
reasoning ability, no matter what happens, you can't make a determination for yourself that's appropriate.
You know what? Let's just launch straight into it. The question, and you've sort of answered it already, is why is it so important to define? And what's the current landscape that makes it so important to define?
Well, the current landscape, recently we've seen the overturns of the Weinstein and the Cosby cases. And the reason that they were overturned is because in prosecuting these cases, they weren't prosecuted on the basis of consent. Neither Pennsylvania nor New York have a definition for consent in their penal codes. In fact, once you define consent, then whether the person used force, fear, fraud, or exploited their incapacity at the time of the act is what will determine whether or not they're guilty. But without a definition for consent, that's impossible.
Was it the Weinstein trial where the judge said to the jurors who asked what consent was, just use your common sense? It was another one.
Both the Weinstein and the Cosby judges both said to them, use your common sense.
Which sounds like the judge doesn't know how to define it.
It's that the judge can't tell them something that's not defined in law. There's an old expression that comes all the way from the Roman era, nulla pene sine lege, which means if it's not stated in law, it's permissible. And so the judge is required to follow very strict adherence to the law. And the judge can't tell them that there's a definition. There is lots of definitions. Nuremberg Code gives us a definition. GDPR, which is protecting your data on the internet, you're in Europe, and the European Union passed GDPR, in fact, approximately the same time that I delivered my TEDx talk. And guess how they define it? They define it the same way that I defined it in my TEDx talk, not knowing anything about GDPR, by the way. I delivered that TEDx talk in March, and at the end of the month, GDPR became public information. So GDPR and Nuremberg Code say, very simply, and, they use different terminology, but it says, freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement. So you can't give somebody, Nuremberg Code has to do with medical treatment.
So okay, I'm a little confused now. So in the US, is it the case then that consent is not defined?
Correct.
That's
100%.
insane. I don't think I really understood that.
And it's not just in the US. The European Union met recently in order to create a doctrine on violence against women. And they decided not to include rape. And the reason that they didn't include it is because they couldn't reach an accord on what consent means.
My
So it's not
God.
just the US. It's
It's
all over
worse
the
than I
world.
thought. It's worse
Oh,
than I
yeah.
thought.
It's
Okay.
dire.
It's
It's
bad.
dire. Okay. So okay, it's a tough. What is consent?
Consent is freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement by a person with the capacity to reason.
Okay,
And when you,
why are they having trouble with that? Because I think I get it. Do you want to, I mean, can you break it down a bit?
okay, um, why are they having trouble? Or can I break it down?
Either.
Answer either one. Either. Okay. So um, let's break it down so everybody understands really what consent is. Okay. Freely given. They can't use force or fear in order to get you to comply. Knowledgeable and informed. They can't trick you or coerce you or use surprise. Jump on you when you're not expecting it. So there are very specific boundaries that the word consent creates, and you have to be you have to have the capacity to reason, because first of all, the laws pertaining to the statute, sorry, not the statute of limitations, underage. Okay. So if you're underage, and underage is different in every jurisdiction, right? You can have underage being 14 in one place and 18 in another place. So there's really no even concept about really what underage means. But we call it the age of consent. When I was growing up, we called it the age of reason. And the word reason was used because if you can't reason properly, then you really can't consent. And that's why we now have what we call the age of consent.
Right. So reason is not necessarily tied to age.
It's tied to ability.
Mm.
And because you need a benchmark in order to prosecute a case, then in penal law, you have to have a sense of, who qualifies as having reached the age of reason and who hasn't qualified as the age of reason. And we don't have unilateral the concept of that issue.
Yeah.
And it would also protect against people who are intoxicated or have a mental capacity deficiency. So that covers that as well.
Yeah. And, here in the United States, most jurisdictions say that, and particularly I'm bringing this up because in New York, they're kind of fighting this battle, that if somebody surreptitiously gives you drugs or gives you alcohol, you're not knowing that, or they give you a pill that knocks you out, you're not possibly consenting, right? But whether they gave it to you surreptitiously or not, whether you're inebriated or whether you're drugged, your mind isn't functioning properly in order to provide consent. So what does it matter whether you knew it or whether you didn't know it? The minute your brain is befuddled,
Yeah.
you're not capable of consent.
Before we get deeper in, I'd like to know from both of you, if you could just give us a sense of why is this so important? What occurred in each of your lives that made this so important to each of you?
As I stated in my TEDx talk, I was sexually assaulted 3 times in different ways. And in none of those instances was there any hope for justice. There was nothing, no police action that could be taken for any one of those cases based on the current laws.
And so you want to make sure the law gets put in place.
Yeah, 100%.
100%, yeah.
When you know something and you're a responsible human being, which I like to think of myself as, although maybe other people might tell you differently. But you have a responsibility to society to do what's right and do the best you can for society. You're not going to be here forever. And how we grow society is based on what happened in the past. I want to make sure that I'm passing along whatever information I can lend to this in order
Yeah.
to make the world a safer place.
I have the same affliction as you. Nina, what about you? How did you come to this?
Well, to add to Joyce's statement, we don't want what happened to us to happen to anyone else. And we're trying to remedy that through education and legal reform. What I can say about my situation is that I'm a survivor of an enormous consent violation. And I was then really kind of consumed with this urge to get justice, achieve justice for myself. And so what happened was I was researching all of these things, trying to find an answer, trying to understand what happened to me and why it was wrong and it was criminal. And I consulted attorneys, I talked to them. I really didn't get any kind of understanding or a pathway to justice. So eventually, I found the work of Joyce Short and the mission of the Consent Awareness Network, and I literally probably said, "Eureka!" I mean, this is what we should be doing. This is the correct definition of consent, and this will assist in preventing incidences and for prosecuting perpetrators. And so I've been doing this with Joyce for about 5 or 6 years. It's really become my life's work as well.
That's amazing. I mean, I will tell you personally that when I came across this definition of consent, I was blown away. I was like, holy shit, that's very, very good. And for myself, because one of the things I was struggling with, with the whole Nixium debacle in 2017, I was the person going to talk to law enforcement, the FBI, the DEA, like all the different people, and I couldn't get them to understand that it was not consensual. They kept on saying, but they agreed. I go, no, they agreed under fraud. And you can't, it can't be consensual if there's blackmail involved. And I couldn't get these people, which were mostly men, I couldn't get them to understand it. I even said, I'll bring legal counsel in to explain it to you. And they couldn't get it. And so you guys know that story. And so the thing I want to talk to you about and just dive into is there are a number of people that have had things happen and they struggle because they feel like, well, I said yes, I agreed. And then
You
people go,
agreed.
well, that was consensual. Now, why is that not the case?
Because there are different kinds of agreement. There's agreement on the face of it. That's what we call assent. Every time you nod your head, you're assenting, right? So when you nod your head and you say yes, you're agreeing. You're assenting, right? Then another type of agreement is acquiescence, and acquiescence is agreement under duress. So what happened to you? You assented. You nod your head and you said yes, but you didn't really give knowledgeable and informed agreement, and you were a person with capacity at the time, right? That's consent. And our laws are very clear. You have to consent. They just don't explain to you that there are other kinds of agreement, and the one that really is important in sexual conduct is consent. They use the word all the time: consent, consent, consent. But they don't tell you there's a difference between assent, acquiescence, and consent.
We found we're forging relationships with many cult survivors because being knowledgeable and informed is an enormous part of your experience. You need to be that. And so what's happening is that when we talk about what consent is, you understand that even though you said yes, even though you complied, even though you didn't run away, that you were not consenting. The law is confused, or society is confused, and Joyce can speak to this a little bit more about the noun consent versus the verb consent. And
Mhm.
so that comes to play in what happened with you and other cult survivors.
Yeah, because I do want to talk about the noun versus the verb, and also because I feel like currently it seems like the law blames the victim, saying, well, you consented, you agreed, you whatever. But then also, as I said, that people walk around saying yes, they feel so bad because they said yes. Like for the longest time, a lot of the survivors of NXIVM, I mean, one of the things I struggled with was just feeling like, yes, but I mean, I agreed. I said, yeah, but, and I would say to them, yeah, but it wasn't really agreement, but I didn't have the words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I'm finding with cult survivors is there's a lot of resonance with this, because what we're saying is it doesn't matter what you said or did. It's about the malicious intention of the perpetrator.
That
And
influenced you.
yes, and the influence. And so what happens is that it gets you to thinking, and you start to say, wow, I may have said yes, I may have agreed or not left or whatever, but I did not consent. And when that is lifted off of you, because who victim blames and shames us the most? We do, ourselves.
Hmm.
And so when you understand that consent is FGKIA, you have this relief because you understand it wasn't about what you said or did. And I think that's a really great gift. I know it was a great gift that this definition brought to me.
Yeah, and also I'm thinking, as a man, I have a very different experience compared to a woman, but I've been thinking a lot about the fawning response, because in the fawning response, the way women have described it to me, they'll say things like, I would do whatever just to be safe because he could have killed me. So I'll do all these things that I don't want to do because the alternative could be death.
Go along to get along.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah,
And I feel like the legal system doesn't seem to understand that, which I
100%.
think ties into it. So tell me, just to go back, what's the difference between the verb and the noun?
Okay. So the noun consent, we've already discussed it. Doesn't hurt to discuss it, to state it
Of
again. It's
course.
freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement by a person with the capacity to reason. It's a thing, and it's individual for you. Consent is not, we hear a lot that consent has to be mutual. I'm sorry, I'm going to use a nasty word. You can you can eliminate
Oh
if
no,
you.
I use them. I use them.
That's bullshit. I'm
Mhm.
sorry. It's absolute bullshit. There is nothing mutual about consent. It's very individual. It's what
Mm.
you feel. And the verb to consent means to convey consent to another. But you have to have consent in order to convey consent. And if you're not defining what consent is, then people assume it's saying yes,
Right.
uh, the things that you do rather than the things that you have, right? This
Yes.
thing that you have is there or it's not there. And if the person used force, fear, fraud, or exploited your incapacity, then what you had couldn't possibly be consent, even though you said yes. And I want to go back to what you're saying about fawning. Some people don't understand what that means, but it's basically going along to get along because you're being coerced into doing that. You're afraid. And when people fear, they could either be experiencing tonic, they could be experiencing tonic immobility, which means they're kind of paralyzed. They're either consciously paralyzed or subconsciously paralyzed. But whether they can think, okay, if I do nothing, I'll not offend this person. I'm not going to get him angrier. I'm not going to expose myself to more violence. I'm just going to get it over with and survive. So your survival mechanism will either, if it's a violent assault, your uh, your survival mechanism is
Mm.
going to protect you, and you could be just frozen and not be able to say no,
Right.
or you could be aware and you could just go along just to get along in order to get it over with. And in the Weinstein case, you had Miriam Haley and Jessica Mann that they're, in their cases, they're, particularly for Jessica, she, in her statement at the sentencing for Weinstein, brought up the fact that she experienced tonic immobility, and she was just frozen. But she had previous sexual encounters with the man. But it's not what you did before, after. It's what happened to influence you at the time of the act itself. So whether you had sex with them previously, whether you didn't have sex with them previously, whether you were wearing a dress that, none of that matters. None of it matters. What matters is, of course, we're a fraud or exploiting your incapacity.
There's a recent article in the New York Times. It was very good, and it talked about these autonomic responses, the fawning, and freezing, and how these are actually biologically based. It's not even something that at the moment you make a decision to do or not do. So what we're saying is that the law has to catch up with science, what we know now. And this is also an example of the hashtag no means no. There are many laws that say if you say, if you say, you have to say no if you want to stop a sexual assault. Well, of course, very often nobody says no. And so they're, with this technicality and how their laws are just badly worded, they're out of luck. And so that's something that we're fighting against, that hashtag in particular.
So Nina, because you're working with trying to change some of the penal code as well. I was just thinking to myself, so defense attorneys know this. They know that there's problems.
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
that's why they don't want to change it.
It's embedded in our laws when they're saying that consent is the verb and not the noun. If they're saying that it's based on the words and actions of the victim, you're going to look at the victim and you're going to rip them apart. Law enforcement does it. Defense attorneys do it. You're totally permitted to do that. We talk a lot about, why is there so much victim blaming and shaming? We have to educate people and say, that's not nice or that's not good. But it's in the law. So a defense attorney is doing a great job if they're going to exploit the bad legal language that's present. There was an example of that in Weinstein's LA case. There were 4 charges against him. Only one person received justice there. A person that did not receive justice was Jennifer Siebel Newsom, and she's the wife of Governor Gavin Newsom, and she was assaulted by Weinstein. And what she had testified to is that in order to get him to stop the assault, she feigned an orgasm. Okay. She pretended to do that and then he stopped. So what happened was when she was on the stand, the defense attorney brought that up and basically said, what could be more of a declaration of consent? Well, the problem is California says in their law, consent is positive cooperation. Okay. So the defense attorney
he actually demanded that she fake an orgasm while she was on the stand.
To demonstrate whatever. It was about humiliation and
Absolutely.
bullying. But of course, she didn't get justice. If you read some of the interviews with the jury, they were, saying things like, well, she emailed him afterward, she saw him at events, things like that, which are irrelevant to the matter of whether or not he assaulted her. So these are the things that happen. And this is why victims don't come forward. We don't come forward. Why? We know this is going to happen. So why should we even bother? But we want to educate the public and let them know it's because it's in the law. That's why this is permissible. That's why this is encouraged. We got to change it.
People try to restore their normalcy. They want to just get back to normal. And they think that if I ignore this, it's going to go away. Or, they're just, and so they go on pretending that they're normal. And it was normal for her to have conversations with Weinstein. And so, she continued doing that. But most people don't say no because they're scared to say no.
Yes. It's honestly so much worse than I thought. Now that I'm really understanding more deeply, because we had a conversation. I feel like it was a couple of years ago, but after doing a lot more of some of the shooting I've been doing, on the films I'm doing, and I'm speaking to more and more victims, I'm seeing what you're saying, that there's such a terror to come forward. It makes perfect sense. One of the things, it's not one thing, but what is the biggest challenge in getting legislators to adopt the definition? What's the challenge that you're having?
Okay. So, half of the legal establishment, well, I shouldn't say half, but a considerable portion of the legal establishment are defense attorneys. Another major portion of the legal establishment are prosecutors, and they both have reasons for not wanting to define consent. We've worked with legislators in many, many different jurisdictions, and the legislators are really very tied to the thinking of prosecutors. Prosecutors are a very, very big, very, very strong influence on our legislators. And I'll give you an example. We were in Arkansas. We had a bill that was pending. I was the expert witness in the hearing that went on in legislation for the committee that was considering that bill. And the prosecutors said that they don't want to be boxed in. And the concept of boxed in means they don't want to take cases that they don't think that they can win. And they can't win them because there's no definition of consent in the law. You and I know that at this point. But they don't want to have to try cases if the woman was wearing something seductive, or if she had sex with them previously, or if they can't have a clear sense of what took place. They don't speak well. They're not going to make a good witness on the stand. They don't want to be boxed in. And but I think that it's actually even is more deeply rooted into what the prosecutor is afraid of themselves, and that is that if they actually acknowledge that we're right, then there's this sense that all along, they'd be doing it wrong, and they don't want to be exposed for having done it wrong.
That's just dumb. That's dumb.
Yeah, it is dumb. It is dumb.
And of course, defense attorneys don't want to be have this at all, obviously. And I would also say that according to statistics, it could be that a number of legislators have consent violations in their past. And when they are confronted with this definition, I would imagine there's some internal panic about that. And it's not something that they want to have codified in the books. And now a lot of states are passing adult survivors acts where you're permitted, there's a 1-year window when you can pursue civil charges against your perpetrator. So, if that happens in their state, they're in trouble. So that's some food for thought as well.
You're not suggesting that prosecutors could be on the narcissism spectrum themselves and could be worried, are you?
Who said that? Who believes that? The other thing is that our legislators want to be reelected. Most of what they do, really, they weigh whether it's this law or any law. Are they going to harm themselves from? Are they going to, actually shoot themselves in the foot so that they don't get reelected if they go along with a particular proposal that their constituents make? And in many areas, of any jurisdiction, there could be people that are very, very tied into this concept of how you treat the opposite sex, and they're afraid that they're going to lose votes from their constituents.
Right. So here's the thought I'm having, and it's not to deny anything you're saying, but I was just thinking to myself, what do we do though with somebody? Let's say somebody feels, they didn't feel violated at the time, then later they have more information, they have a better understanding of a deeper sense of self. they develop more backbone, a bunch of different things, as you do in life, generally speaking. And then you look back at something that happened a while ago, and you say, I don't feel that that was entirely consensual. And it feels like a slippery thing because you're like, well, where's the exact line? Because we all evolve. Like I'm not a woman, of course, but there's things I look back at my life and go like, oh my God, I wish I knew then what I know now, because I would have told that person to go fuck off, basically. But I didn't have
You
it
do,
in me
but yeah,
to do it.
yeah. But okay, so there's actually no line.
Okay.
Reality is, okay, and people say you just changed your mind
Mm.
or you want to get even. You want to twist it so that it appears that you didn't consent. Okay.
Mm.
And there's a difference between that conduct having been a violation and that conduct not having been a violation. So if you look back and realize, I was scared to death, or I was drunk out of my mind. I was slurring. I was falling down, and yeah. So you need to be able to be aware that what actually qualified as consent in order to know I was raped or sexually assaulted, or I wasn't raped or sexually assaulted. If you change your mind, that doesn't, if you change your mind during that sexual encounter and you make it obvious to the person that you have changed your mind, then that person has to stop. But what you
Yes.
did up until that point is not a violation. What's a violation is when you say stop, they have to stop. Or if they used force, fear, fraud, or exploited your incapacity, then you definitely,
That
when
that makes
I
sense.
go into school and I talk to kids about sexual encounters, I'll say to them, "Hey, I know you all know the F word for sex,
Mm.
but do you know that there are 3 F words that should never take place in sex? And they're force, fear, and fraud." So when you look back and you evaluate whether what happened to you was a violation or not, did the person use force, fear, fraud, or did they use what I call the I word, exploit your incapacity? If they did
That's
any
so
of those
good.
things, you were raped, you were sexually assaulted. And I
Right.
have, there's a dividing line between what the law says is rape and what the law says is sexual assault. In our concept, actually, and in most jurisdictions, the concept of rape is it's a violent act of sexual assault. So it's an aggravated case of
That
sexual
makes
assault.
perfect sense what you're saying, because there is an objective reality about the person's conduct, the perpetrator's conduct, let's say, that is independent really of the state of mind of the victim. Like either they used coercion or they didn't.
Yes.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Um, what's the best way for somebody, if somebody had an experience, they're not sure, they look at this definition, what's the best way for them to unpack? Did what happened to me, was it coercive? Was it bad? What happened to me? What's the best way? It's a very simplistic question, I know.
Well, a
Yeah.
great manual to consult on that is Joyce's book, Your Consent, the Key to Conquering Sexual Assaults. It's a manual about 30 pages long or so. And when you go through that, she outlines very clearly all of the things that we've been discussing, all of the situations that you can find yourself in. And it's a great way to figure out and sort out what's happening and what has happened to you. And then, of course, watching her TEDx talk. It's invaluable. When survivors read it, they're very they feel very informed. They definitely have a clear understanding of what happened to them, so that it gives them voice, gives them language to use, and that's so very important because obviously when we're violated, we understand something's wrong. We don't quite know what it is. You were speaking about, you didn't have the words, you didn't have the language, you didn't have the concepts. And so that's what we're trying to, that's the gift that Joyce is trying to give to survivors through her book.
That's so important. And also I'm thinking, when you get thrust into the public sphere, like I was having trouble with law enforcement explaining what happened to these women. I wasn't even talking about myself. I was just saying what happened to these women. And also I was struggling on television to explain it. Like I was getting interviewed and I didn't have, I mean, I wish I had this definition because I could have stuck it in some of these reporters' faces. It's such a good definition. But that's the other thing I wanted to ask you. I have my sense of it, but why do you think generally this is such a difficult concept for people to grasp? Never mind the legal system, just people in general. Why is this so difficult to grasp?
Because, our laws, okay, I'm going to go back to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She has a couple of expressions that I love. One of them is, and I haven't used this a lot recently, so let me put my thinking cap on. Basically, and I'm paraphrasing it because she said it in kind of language that it's kind of back a few years.
Yeah.
We don't do that commonly, but basically, it's that society's morals create our laws, and our laws create society's morals. And
Interesting.
yeah. And so if you don't have a guidepost for creating society's morals, then society has lots of different concepts. And that's been the case because of this deficiency of defining consent. That's been a deficiency that has come down through the ages. And we're now ingrained with concepts that are fictitious or not appropriate. And people swear by them. This is their belief system.
Yeah, there's some well-intentioned consent education going on out there. And there's a couple things that are problematic with that. First of all, they're dealing with all these tropes that we find very harmful, and they're victim blaming. Yes means yes. Yes doesn't always mean I consent. Certainly, you know that. The no means no situation. Oh gosh, enthusiastic consent, boy, oh boy. As if like everything that you have to consent to, you have to I think about a cheerleader, like, yeah, rah, rah, rah. I mean, when I sign a mortgage doc, there's no enthusiasm there. Or, not apparent. And this also goes into the First Amendment, our freedom of expression, saying that for consent to be valid, you have to be enthusiastic or whatever that means. So that's an issue too. So consent education is also stuck with the fact that consent's not defined in the law. And you'd want this to be congruous, right? If you're trying to teach folks what consent is, you also want to give them the assurance that it's backed up with ironclad legal language and legislation, and it's not. And I know before I explored Joyce's work, I didn't know what consent was. I thought it was action-based and words in action-based. And that's what's being taught in consent education. And so the problem with that is you come out feeling protected, right? You come out feeling like, I thought that all this was said and done in the legal system. I mean, consent's such a big word in society and the zeitgeist, right? So I also feel that people are getting a false sense of protection, and I'm thinking that this has, again, all been sorted out, and that should they need to pursue justice, that it's going to be there for them.
I wanted to say something about what Nina brought up, and that has to do with no means no, yes means yes.
Yeah.
Here in New York, in 2015, the legislation passed a law that actually codified yes means yes into law, and it's used in and required that colleges and universities throughout New York had to include that language in their code of conduct. And yet, the penal code for New York says no means no. So there's a there's a conflict right there in what appears in our legal system, and neither one of them is correct. And the other thing that's I think important to understand is that consent is not just about sexual contact. It's about everything. All crimes occur because the person did not consent to a specific act. And we know, if somebody hits you over the head with a 2x4 and they take your property, you didn't consent to it, right? And we all learn everything we know about consent from our upbringing. Your parents will teach you, don't hit your baby brother, don't, in order to get what you want, don't, don't lie about it to your sister that you want if you want to borrow, let's say if you want to borrow her pink sweater, don't wait until she's asleep and go into her bureau and take her sweater from her. So all these things our parents teach us as we're growing up, but they're just not reflected in the law. Our parents give us the guidelines as we're growing. They're the enforcers. But and when we step out of our homes and we're now in the larger sphere of behavior, we expect our laws to help us enforce morality. But
Right.
when it comes to sexual contact, it doesn't.
I wanted
Right.
to also address, if you permit me, Mark, the
Of course.
branding and DOS situation.
Yeah.
So I did see the vow, and what happened in that there's an audio recording of Keith Raniere walking with Allison Mack.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll try to summarize it. Basically, he's saying, we have to get the issue of consent out of the way. So why don't you have the women say something along the lines of, Master, will you please brand me? It would be an honor, something like that, which he felt would constitute consent. And indeed, because we have yes means yes understanding, this is letting crimes go on. This is an instruction manual. Keith was very well aware that would not be consent, but he wanted to have that legal protection. And so, even with Dr. Danielle Roberts, thankfully, she's had her medical degree stripped. She was, of course, the one who did the branding. She came out later on and said, they agreed, they consented, they said yes. And it's funny for me to think that of all people, a physician would not understand that consent is always informed. It's part of its definition. And so that was just a way that Keith got around things. And it was very clever. And it was very within the legal parameters.
Yeah.
Doctors have to adhere to Nuremberg Code. Nuremberg Code was created back in about somewhere between 1947 and 1949, when the Nazis that had performed horrific experiments on the people that they had incarcerated in prison camps, they were brought up for trial, and ultimately Nuremberg Code was created in order to create those protections. So all medical practitioners are very, very well acquainted with what consent is from the doctrine of Nuremberg Code, and Nuremberg Code states it pretty consistent with the definition that we gave you.
Unless, and I'm going to say this carefully for legal reasons, unless they're in a cult and their brains have become addled and they answer to a higher order, a higher bullshit order.
Yeah.
It's interesting what you say about Keith, because, sometimes he was kind of smart and sometimes he was just dumb and he didn't get enough exposure to the world. Because I remember early days, hearing about that back in 2017, way before the trial, thinking, well, that's bullshit. Like, he's trying to cover his ass. But I know that's bullshit. But again, the problem was I'm not a lawyer. I didn't know how to explain why that is not valid. Now, in looking at your work, I feel like so much better armed, so to speak, to explain why that was never valid. Because just simply, when you have blackmail, you can't consent to, you can't freely give consent after that point to anything.
Correct. 100%.
It's also interesting in Keith's prosecution. As you know, Moira Penza came up with which was first used with her, as far as I can understand, about these types of abusers, the racketeering, the RICO law, the sexual and human trafficking charges. That was very great. I mean, they used that in the Ghislaine Maxwell trials, R. Kelly, Peter Nygard, and they used it with great success. However, I do want to point out that not one person who was sexually assaulted by Keith Raniere received individual justice. And this is because Moira knew that we couldn't prove, or she couldn't prove, that there was no consent present. Well, one of the reasons is because, people complied. They said yes, they didn't run away. And also because consent's not defined in the state of New York. And of course, Albany is where Keith operated out of. So, I'm glad that he's behind bars.
Yeah.
But like I said, nobody received their individual justice.
What you're saying is accurate, because I remember, I had many, many meetings before the trial, and there was a certain point where Moira said, we're not going to use that word. We're not going to use that word. We're not going to use that word. You can use the word if you want, but we're not going to use it. And it was so interesting. And I said, why? Because it's so obvious. She said, because I can't prosecute on that basis. Like we couldn't use the word cult ever, because the can of worms it opens up. I don't believe we used consent, as far as I remember, because of the can of worms. So,
in New York penal code, no means no is the basis of consent. So if you didn't say no.
So we're on the topic now, but I was thinking, I think some of these high profile cases, Weinstein, and with us, the NXIVM thing, I think it has helped the public understand these things a little better, hasn't it?
It's helped them recognize that we have a problem. But they don't recognize what the solution is, right? Stories are great. Me Too did a wonderful job of making it public information that we have a considerable amount of sexual assault in society. But stories alone aren't the solution. You have to give the solution in order to have the solution. And here's why it's important. Here in the United States, the 14th Amendment guarantees our right to equal protection under the law. In the Weinstein prosecutions, the judges, the juries asked, "What's the definition for consent?" And the judge, his hands were tied. So now, every jury has to decide for themselves what consent is, and how do you possibly have equal protection under the law if every single jury has a different sense of what's the crime? Consent is really the determining factor in whether there was a crime. But if you don't know what consent is, then what happens in one jury on one side of the hall can be completely different from what happens in another jury on the other side of the hall. You can have people, fortunately, in the Cosby case in Pennsylvania, the head of the jury was familiar with general data protection regulation. And just like Nuremberg Code, and just like my TEDx talk, there's a consistent definition: freely given, knowledgeable, informed agreement. But that foreperson can't be the foreperson in each and every jury. We have to have consistency. We have to have a definition. And without a definition, you're not going to have equal protection.
No, exactly. And the juries are not equipped to reason this out, especially with the pressure and the fatigue and a whole bunch of things. What are there success stories that sort of CAN's advocacy has actually helped, create meaningful changes that you're happy about?
We were really ecstatic that the U.S. House of Representatives actually passed our amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. NDAA controls the military. It controls UCMJ. I'm using a lot of letters here. That's the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Here in the United States, the jurisdiction with the highest volume of sex crimes is the U.S. military. Alaska is the worst state. Arkansas is the second worst state. And we've worked with all of them, but we were able to succeed in getting the amendment passed in the U.S. House of Representatives. But then the Senate came along and withdrew our amendment from the final version, the final draft of NDA. So, we've made progress. We have a bill pending right now in New York that we're going to have to resubmit because it wasn't approved in this particular legislative session. So we're going to have to introduce it again. But it basically is very simply, consent is freely given, knowledgeable and informed agreement by a person with capacity to reason. And we've introduced it not just in sexual assault cases, that's Section 130 of penal law in New York. We introduced it in general law, which means that it will apply to everything because it is the same in everything. Consent is the same whether it's protecting your money, whether it's protecting you from medical treatment that you don't that you haven't really consented to, whether you've consented to somebody burning your property, right? Why would you do that? Well, maybe there's a reason.
Yeah.
But yeah, anything that you do that doesn't have your consent, if it's considered a crime in the law books, it's the definition is the same, and we have to apply equally.
I'm so happy you said that because I was thinking about, why this weird, murky avoidance of this thing in the world. And I was thinking maybe it's because every time I hear the word consent, it's either used in connection with sexual abuse, or that's where my mind goes. And your point is very good because I feel like it's such a murky thing. People are so scared about it. I think men get scared when they hear the word consent because they think I'm going to get in trouble. They don't even reason it out. And it feels almost like, I'm going to sound weird for a second. It feels almost like we're living in some kind of a cult where, when you talk to a cult member about something, they can't process something. Sometimes this conversation feels a bit like that to me, where people can't seem to even process this. But I do think it's one of the most important conversations. And especially as you're saying, it could be about your money. Those litigators should think about that. Consent could be about your money, not just sex. My God.
Exactly. Yep. It's about everything. I was on a train when I first moved to New York, and I was going to work, and I was in a hurry. I put my token. We don't have tokens anymore in New York. Shows you my age. But I stuck my wallet back in my bag, and I'm running for the train, and probably didn't close my bag very well. And I get on the train, and there's a nice looking man next to me. He's well dressed. He looks, fairly, I wasn't afraid of him. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
There was a guy to my right, and that man looked pretty sketchy. And so I'm kind of inching a little bit closer. It's a crowded train, but I'm inching a little closer. Also, the guy to my left, he gives me the handle to hold on to. And so I'm inching a little closer to him. And as the train is moving along, this man, the sketchy guy on my right, his hand goes across my body, and I'm thinking, oh, geez, I'm being attacked here. And he grabs the arm of the nice-looking man standing next to me, who had my wallet in his hand. I was very fortunate. This man, the sketchy-looking man, was an undercover policeman. And the man on my left, obviously, was a pickpocket. And the police and the authorities had no problem prosecuting this guy. I mean, it was a slam dunk. I wasn't even called in to testify. But just imagine if instead of taking my wallet, he reached for my crotch. Mm. When I went into, this guy next to me probably would have grabbed his arm. But would the prosecutors have tried that case? Well, I inched closer to him, didn't I? And I had on a pretty dress. I must have been asking for it. So there's really a real, something going on in our brains that we can't equate a very simple understanding to everything across the board.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's a big hurdle.
Yeah, there's so many crimes that, I'm sorry, I'm just saying, sex and human trafficking. We have stealthing. If you know what stealthing is, it's
No, what is stealthing?
Oh, stealthing is getting to have a lot of press, so much so that there are laws being introduced and passed with it. Stealthing is non-consensual condom removal. And so that's actually, they've tried to do some stopgap measures because you see, if consent were defined, we wouldn't have to have a stealthing bill, right? We wouldn't have to have a bill about posting intimate images on the internet. We wouldn't have to have that. And the stealthing bill, stealthing is about sexual fraud. But it doesn't include other elements of sexual fraud, like lying about birth control, sexually transmitted diseases, other forms of barrier protection. So that law is it doesn't have the teeth that was intended for that. And also, I have a quick story about a woman in Pennsylvania. Consent is not defined in Pennsylvania. She found that her partner had been for years posting, intimate images of her online. So she did what she did to try to get him to stop, initially. And then she approached authorities. And there is a law in Pennsylvania that deals with non-consensual intimate image sharing. We used to call it revenge porn. I understand there's about 48 laws in the states about this. But what happens is they replicate the language. And if it's bad language, you're getting 48 bad languages. So what happened is in this non-consensual intimate image sharing law, the crime is not the non-consensual posting of your images. The crime deals with the state of mind of the offender. Did the offender want to hurt you, bully you, coerce you, embarrass you? So unless you can prove the state of mind in these laws, which are, again, all across the country, you're out of luck. Good luck trying to prove that. So, of course, her offender said, well, gosh, I didn't mean to do any of that. So what happened was he was permitted to plead down to disorderly conduct, and he paid a $10 fine, and her images were not removed. So again, so many of these laws don't have the oomph that we need them to have because consent is not defined in the law to back them up.
I feel sometimes, and this is very conspiratorial, but I feel sometimes that the legal system has been created by abusers.
It is.
I go, well, what the hell? That doesn't make sense. That unless you're trying to protect something.
Yeah, and here's one that's happened recently. We've seen ASA, Adult Survivors Act, and the Adult Survivors Act take sexual assault out of the realm of crime and put it into the realm of civil action. Well, here's the problem with that. When you take it out of the realm of crime, the prosecution can't be involved. It's not really, you don't get justice. And when you have it in the realm of civil action, you need an attorney to actually represent your interests. And you're not going to get an attorney unless that person is high profile or has assets that are considerable, because it's all about money. It's all about getting a reciprocity from a standpoint of, getting a monetary verdict that puts money in your pocket. But if that person doesn't have a pot to pee in, then how are you going to find an attorney that's going to take your case? Or if that person doesn't have a high profile that might give that attorney a little bit more publicity, so that they can get more cases and make more money, then how are you going to get how are you going to get an attorney to prosecute the case? So ASA, it's great. It's wonderful that they brought it, that it's helped a lot of people that are, working with people with great assets or high profile. But what do the poor people do?
Yeah.
It's a very difficult, so ASA is great for some cases, but by and large, it doesn't change the concept of society. It doesn't provide the kind of the kind of justice that people actually need. And
Right.
for that reason, it's just
Right.
another example of how our laws work in ways that are inappropriate.
Yeah, that was passed in New York State, and the organizers of it, or the supporters of the bill, of the law, were surprised. They
Hmm.
thought that so many more people would come forward.
Yeah, about 2,700 came forward,
Yeah.
and a lot of them withdrew because it got too costly for them to pursue their cases.
Right.
So, yeah.
What motivates you? What keeps you going on this mission despite what seems like enormous? I mean, obviously I feel angry just listening to all of this, not at you. I just feel angry at the system. What motivates the two of you just to continue the fight?
Susan B. Anthony struggled for 50 years in order to uh, get women the right to vote. And once you know something has to be done, if you're a responsible person, you pursue it. And we know how tremendously impactful this will be for society. And how do we possibly turn our backs on it? I personally can't. I know that Nina can't. She's been with me for 5 years in this struggle. It's just not something you know, that you can walk away from and just leave society unprotected. It's just not in my heart to do that.
We don't want this to happen to anyone else. And also, it's all about education on our part, to let people know we are not protected. You should be fearful, because we need to define consent in the law. And then, it's like I said, it's all about education, changing hearts and minds, if you will. And again, for me, it's just to help other survivors understand that it's not their fault. And, and also, like with you, provide the language, provide the arguments, if you will, and just spreading our message. And we're doing it bit by bit. And, it's an uphill struggle for all the reasons we discussed today.
It is. I mean, what would help in terms of, obviously the law changing would help, but what would help your organization, do you think, the most?
Well, I think that obviously it's getting an understanding of our work and our mission, and going back to Joyce's book. She has it right there behind her, Your Consent, the Key to Conquering Sexual Assault. It's very informative. I believe reading it is very healing, and it just gives the language and the concepts, and it covers basically so much more than we've even spoken about today. We also have a petition that we have, and any kind of support with that would be appreciated, and comments on that as well. And again, to watch Joyce's TED Talk, it's 15, 16 minutes, and that's kind of the encapsulation of her book in there. And the key really is for people to understand the problem and to understand the solution, and that's to define consent as FGKIA.
Love that. I'm going to be putting all the URLs and the notes and everything in the show notes. Is there anything that and I know it's a vast topic, is there anything like really important that we haven't addressed today that you think is important that people should know or think about?
Again, I just want, for me, survivors, you're not alone. Learn about this concept. It will help in your healing journey. It's so important, from that aspect, and to spread the word. Let people know consent's not defined, and that's a problem. And we're vulnerable, and the system is stacked against us as survivors of all sorts of things, cult abuse, and all the other things we've discussed today, because this is not enshrined or embedded in our laws.
And also, I think stressing the fact that this is something that is worldwide. It's not just New York, or not Denmark, or not Paris. It's
Yeah.
everywhere, and
Yeah.
we have to make those changes.
And they're getting it wrong. They're getting it wrong. I'm sorry. Like in Australia, they passed yes means yes legislation. It's wrong,
I
and
saw
it's
that.
Yeah. And also a number of states in the European Union, and they're very happy. They're like, wow, this is going to be great. Wow, it's going to help so many people, but it wouldn't help you, Mark.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I have found your work to be a revelation. Like, coming out of the cult, this was me as a man. And obviously I was trying to go to bat for all the women that had been hurt, but also as a guy, I was like, man, my boundaries were just walked all over. And like, I didn't understand how to maintain my boundaries. And like, well, perhaps I agree to everything. But then even my first, call to exit counselor say, you didn't agree. You agreed to these things here. You didn't agree to all this other stuff that you were unaware of. And even if you perhaps were aware, there's certain coercive elements at play. So for me, the definition alone has been such a light bulb moment for me. And I share it with everybody I know. Anybody who's got an issue coming up, and I said, do you know about this definition? And I share the definition. They're like, oh my God, that's so good.
Yay. Have
It's
we my
so
book?
Yes, yes, exactly. So I'm
Please.
gonna link all those things. But thank you both for the incredible work you're doing. It is not easy, I can imagine. It is not easy.
It can be discouraging, but we have to fight the good fight. And, we know that this will help so many people. And that's why we do what we do.
I'm so happy that you raised the issue that as a man, that it affected you, because oftentimes we're being accused of being feminazis, and the reality is that we're talking about consent laws are not specific to whether you're a man, whether you're a woman. Actually, there are antiquated laws that really stated that rape was a male attacking the female.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in modern morality, I think we really have a very different concept, and we need a law that will protect men as well as women. And I
Yeah.
get mouth for saying that, but that's reality.
No,
Nobody
it is
us
it is a human problem, but I mean, I do acknowledge that I think women are particularly vulnerable. But yes, I mean, I agree. It is a human problem as well.
Joyce often says we want to take our human right of consent and, make it a civil right enshrined in the law. I mean, all good people know that everyone is entitled to their bodily autonomy and personal agency, and to be free from bad actors who seek to undermine that. And, it's really a human rights issue. And that's another thing that we stress.
It's nulla, going all the way back to nulla pene sine lege. You absolutely have to have things in the law to create the protections that we need. And that's the difference between it being a human right and a civil right. We have to adopt it into law so that human right does become a civil right backed by law.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Nina, very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
And to my audience, as always, stay curious.